So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. Welcome for those of you in person and those of you in cyberspace. Appreciate all of you being here today. We're going to talk today about anti-Semitism. I like to make a joke of what's not a joke, which is that Benjamin Franklin said that there are not two things, but there are three things that a person cannot miss out on, or the three things that are inevitable, which are death, taxes, and anti-Semitism. It's an unfortunate reality. And I don't know if we were living in a little bit of a golden age or deluded over the last number of years, last 50 years, post-Holocaust, as we felt very comfortable and very safe. And now, it seems that many of us don't feel this way. And what I want to do today is to really investigate in the Bible, a story of anti-Semitism. And we're going to do that. But to get there, I wanted to, we'll start on the top of the page. And if at any point you have a question, just let me know. I think that you have the ability to unmute yourselves, or those in the room. It's always complex to be doing sort of these two things together at the same time, but it's great that we can. So the first source on the top of the page, it says Shabbat. It's supposed to say Shabbat. It comes from the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. We'll give it at, let's say it was written in the year 650. Let's just give that. It's the oral conversations of the rabbis over the course of a number of hundreds of years in the study halls that they put together. And this is a piece of Talmud. This is in an area in the Talmud, even though it's Tractate Shabbat, and thus is about the laws of Shabbat, where the discussions are really about the Sinai experience. When the Jews stood at Sinai and God revealed in the 10 utterances, the Aseret HaDibrot, as people call them popularly, the 10 Commandments, and the Talmud is telling all sorts of fantastical stories about it. And amongst those stories, they're discussing the name Sinai Peninsula. And the rabbis make the following statement. Amar lehahu me Rabbanan leRav Kahana. So one of the sages said to Rav Kahana, Mishmi alach mai har Sinai. He says, what's the reason? Why is it called Har Sinai? Right? Why isn't it called Everest? Why isn't it called K2? Like why is it called Sinai? Amar le har shena'asu bo nisim li Yisrael. He's saying Sinai, and he's sort of reversing the word from sin to nes. It's the place where miracles happen for Israel. That is why it's called Har Sinai. That's why it's called Har Sinai. So the rabbis argue Har Nisai mibayale, that it should be called Har Nisai, not Har Sinai. Ella Har Shanasa Simin Tov Israel. So they're trying to change it around. Sinai, kind of like Siman, Simin Tov Mazel Tov. We hear the Sa, we hear the Na afterwards. So the rabbis say Har Simanai mibayale. Then it should be called Har Simanai. Okay, so two possibilities, and both these two possibilities are good things. A place of miracles, a place of good luck and good omens. So we have another suggestion. So it's part of a longer discussion, and skip down to the end of the last line in the Hebrew. Or in the English, it's in the bold. As Rav Chisda and Rav Huna, son of Rabbi Yoshua, they both said, what is Har Sinai? Again, the same question. My Har Sinai. And they say, what is Har Sinai? Har sheyarda sin'a le'umot ha'olam alav. A very interesting statement, which is, it's the mountain upon which hatred came down to the nations of the world. Now, before I try to say anything more, anybody want to suggest or think what that might mean? It's called Sinai. Now, let me explain. Sinai, Hebrew hatred, sin'ah. They're spelled different. One is a samach and a nun. One is a sin and a nun. But clearly the sound is the same, Sinai, Sin'ah. There's no reason to think that there is a actual relationship between the two words. But the rabbis are doing what the rabbis do, which is they're giving a drasha, they're trying to give an explanation. And the idea that the two words sound the same, sinai, sina, right? If somebody here was teaching a Jewish school or something and said to the kids, write Sinai, write Sina, they would probably, if they didn't know this yet, they would either spell both words with a samach and a nun or both words with a sin and a nun, spelling them both the same way. So any reactions to this source before any reactions to it, any thoughts about it? If not, that's okay. Yes, it's a wordplay. Thank you, Judy. So, and you can unmute yourself if you'd like to say something, that would be great. And if not, at any time. So Sinai, we don't know what Sinai means. It's just a place. Sinah clearly means hatred. So there's no relationship between the two words in terms of what they actually mean. Like it says here, it's a wordplay. So let me just tell you two different things that you can decide. You can talk about if you like them, you don't like them, what you want to say. So one way of looking at this Gemara, one way of looking at this piece of Talmud is that, what does it mean hatred came down? It means that the Gentiles got upset, that they didn't get the Torah and the Jews did get the Torah. It means in a similar way that sort of when God gave us the Torah, thank you so much for this Torah, but with it came this hatred, almost like it's inevitable, almost like the two are a very, very sad pair, right? You know this in life, you have friends, you have associates, people you work with, whatever it might be, and sometimes in life, you got to take the good with the bad. That's the way it is. Now, I don't know if this is if taking the good here is worth that bad thousands of years later and everything we've had in Jewish history. So one way of saying of understanding the source is we got the Torah and with it came hatred from everybody else. There is a second way of reading it, which is less charitable to Jews, which maybe we may sort of discuss in a different way, which is when the Jews got the Torah, they felt that they were better. Look what we have and you don't. Look what God did for us and you didn't. And it made us, in a sense, very arrogant. It lended us to all of a sudden having this belief that we were better. And we know that this is not what we're going to just really get into today. And there are many reasons and many sources, many ideas within anti-Semitism and reasons for anti-Semitism. We can't explain it. But there are those who dislike Jews because they think that Jews think that they're better, that Jews think that they're special. And that is one way. It's not the majority way, but that is one way of understanding this piece of Talmud, which in today's day and age, we would call in some ways victim shaming, right? Oh, why do they hate you? Why do we hate you? We hate you because you say you're better than us. Well, I'm telling you, I'm saying I'm not better than you. I'm not. This is a responsibility. This is, excuse the analogy, cross to bear. This is not me believing that I'm better than any of you. But it's a fascinating source. And to me, it's just fascinating that throughout the eras, different rabbis who have studied this piece of Talmud have looked at it in completely different ways. Some of it being, unfortunately, we got the Torah and they didn't, so they were jealous and upset and angry and they hate us, versus, no, we are, puffing our chest and saying we're so great, and others saying that they are angry at us. Okay, if you want to comment at any point, you can unmute yourself, I believe it. This source is coming hundreds of years later. This source is coming thousands of years later about this episode, an attempt to understand the source, but it's not what we have. It's not at the time. It's later, and it's obviously the rabbis. Their anti-Semitism already exists. They feel like the Jews feel like they're picked on. They feel like things are not right, and so this is a place where they reflect upon it.
The time that we got the Torah, we had already been chosen as the chosen, right? And so,
it sort of came together, I guess you could say.
Okay. I was just saying that, that would be another reason for, being conceited or thinking that we were better. People perceive us being better for.
Right. I think that it comes together at the same time. This is saying so. Okay.
Would you please repeat the questions that are said in the room, because we can't quite hear that?
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes, I will. Yeah.
Beautiful Torah, adorned. How would that compare aesthetically in those days to a golden calf or whatever else somebody might celebrate?
So it's hard to answer that question. Well, I guess I have to talk about in the Talmudic period. It's not going to be as the ornate as what the other nations have. Our temples are nice, our temples are beautiful, even especially following Herod. But this source is coming after the Jews are exiled. We no longer have a Talmud. We have a Talmud. We no longer have a temple. We no longer have a capital city. So whatever other sort of objects that were asked about that might have been worshiping, our objects would not have been as beautiful, even with a Torah with a beautiful, crown on the top and a beautiful gold breastplate, et cetera, et cetera. So interesting to think as such. Okay, so I want to continue. This is really just to a source which is not the main thing that I wanted to discuss today, because this is coming much later than the Bible. And here the rabbis are, in a sense, opining. And I think it's less historical, and it's more from a sense of just why anti-Semitism might exist. But they're saying anti-Semitism, in a sense, starts at Sinai. And what I want to show you today is that, unfortunately, anti-Semitism starts a lot earlier than that. To those of you who are in cyberspace, just a quick thing. Somebody asked me to share my screen. So now I have sort of this Microsoft Word document in front of you. So if you have a question or a comment, just unmute yourself, because I don't see the chat at the same time. I could use Zoom 201 or something to help me with that. So continuing here, let's look at this first. So to get to anti-Semitism, which we're going to see is early on in the Torah, I want to start from the book of Shemot. So this is the opening chapter of the book of Shemot. The Jews are in Egypt. They've come down. It's all good. There was a famine, but things are good. That's why they're in Egypt. Joseph is there. They're taken care of. But then things, as they sadly often do, change very quickly. And it changes here with the words in Hebrew, Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. A new king came in Egypt, one who did not know Joseph. So, and there's a whole discussion. Did he really not know Joseph? Did he pretend that he didn't know Joseph? And what does he say? Vayo el amo. Am b'nei Yisrael rav va'atzum mimenu. We're still on the first page, by the way, on the bottom source of that first page. Next time, somebody remind me to number them, make it easier. So he says, look, he says to his people, the Israelite people are too numerous for us. Pharaoh is the first person historically who calls the Jewish people a nation. He says to his people, those other people. Okay, the first one. I imagine that in your mind, you're thinking of Nazi Germany, right? They didn't ask questions, how observant you are, how you see yourself as a Jew. Do you have lox and bagels on Sunday morning? Do you have cholent? Are you Sephardi? Are you Ashkenazi? How many Jewish grandparents do you have? Right? Pharaoh doesn't ask those questions. He just says, those Jews, and categorizes us all together. And we know from that, with enslavement and genocide of the Jews is what comes as a result of that. We are the Egyptians. This is this other nation. And if you look there, one of the main accusations that comes out of anti-Semitism is what Pharaoh says. And we know that this has been said, and it is still said in America today and in other places. And it's not only said about Jews, but we know it's said about Jews. What does he say there in the next verse? He says, right, their nation is so great and they're multiplying so much. And what's going to happen if we get invaded? They're going to join our enemies and fight against us. They're going to rise up from the ground. They are a fifth column. They are not loyal. They are not truly part of the Egyptian people, even though they have been living here for a while. Remember, the Jews are in Egypt 100 years. And this is not 5 years in or 10 years in. Joseph by this point has passed away. It's a couple of generations later. So the Jews, in many ways, should be part of Egyptian culture. Maybe they didn't assimilate fully. Maybe they've stayed somewhat separate in some ways, but they are part of Egyptian culture and they're being told not. And the next verse, Pharaoh introduces the idea of setting taskmasters, enslaving them. Following that, we have, of course, the Jewish babies, the baby boys are killed. And of course, therefore, we then get to the story of Moses and him being saved in the basket, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the first place where we see a genocide, all the Jewish baby boys. First place we see enslavement of the Jewish people. And it's very sad because it's even, you could say it's almost before our founding. It's even before we are brought into the world as a people. It's before we stand at Sinai. It's before we even have the covenant of God. But what I want to show you today is that it doesn't start there. Genocide doesn't happen on day one. We know that from our history. We know that, again, Nazi Germany, we know that from many times that to take a group and to commit a genocide, to enslave them, it's not something that happens on day one. It's something that happens over the course of a lengthy period of time, demonizing and demonstrating that this people is lesser. And I want to show it to you from the book of Bereshit. Everybody with me out there? Any questions, any things that we could know? Okay. All right, great. Okay. So we're going to turn back into the book of Bereshit. And we know the basic story of the book of Bereshit. For people who don't know, I don't know who knows, who doesn't know, right? We have this guy, his name is Abraham. He leaves his land. He goes to a different, God tells him things are not so easy for him, even though God says that, you know, things will be perfect. You'll be blessed. You'll be wealthy. You'll have children. Things don't happen so easily for him. His wife can't give birth. He's got multiple children. His children don't get along so well. He has to separate from his nephew. Things are not so simple. Eventually, his monotheistic, ethical monotheism is granted over to his son, and then to one of his two grandsons, to Isaac and to Jacob, and to their wives, to Isaac's wife, Rebecca, and Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah. Jacob's life isn't easy either. He is abandoned. He runs out. He goes all the way to his uncle and aunt. Eventually, he comes home. He's got lots of kids. And we can thank the rabbis about 1,000 years ago, Rabbeinu Gershom, Ashkenaz, who told the Ashkenazi Jews 1,000 years ago that a man should only have one wife, because more than one very often it leads to problems. And so it leads to problems in the house of Jacob. He's got multiple children, and one of them is Joseph, and Joseph's a little bit of an arrogant young man and a tattletale, and tells on his brothers, but his father favors him, and his brothers don't like him, and eventually he is, as a result, as we know, enslaved down to Egypt. I'm sorry, it may not be as entertaining as the Disney cartoon or whatever it is that I have just done in the last few minutes. So Joseph is in Egypt. He's enslaved. He's thrown into a pit. He's brought down to Egypt, and he becomes a leader. He becomes a leader of the, I see your question, we'll come back to it, remind me of it later. He becomes he's a slave in the house of a man named Potiphar, and Joseph is a charmed person. Joseph is somebody who, whatever he does, seems to work for him. And so he's in a house of Potiphar, just a slave, he's a fun slave, but he rises to the top. And Potiphar's wife wants to seduce him. And I apologize if you know these stories, and but Potiphar's wife wants to seduce him. She wants to sleep with him. There's a theory there. Potiphar is a eunuch, probably. He's called a saris, which means a eunuch. And so Potiphar's wife, it's not so surprising that she, she's denied sexual encounters because her husband is a eunuch, and she wants to sleep with Joseph, and she bothers him every day. And that's what the second source, if you're on the document, it's on the second page in the middle. It's from the 39th chapter of the book of Bereshit. Vayhi kayom, it was that day. Vayavo abayta lasom latovi ein ish me'anshe habayit sham babayit. So it's a day, and maybe it's some sort of festivals going on. And Joseph, like every other day, he goes from, let's say, the servants' quarters to the main house, and nobody else is there. And what happens is the wife of Potiphar, she grabs Joseph by the garment and she says, sleep with me. No subtlety there. Okay, sleep with me. And Joseph, imagine him wearing a toga sort of, and not the clothing that we wear. Joseph sort of runs away, and she's left with his clothing in her hand, and he runs out. And when she sees that she's got the clothing but not the man, she gets upset, and she calls her servants. And if you look at the bold, I want you to look at the bold of what it says here in the Hebrew along with the English. She calls the other servants and she says, look what has been brought to us. Ish ivri litzachek banu. Look what's been brought to my house as a slave, a Hebrew to dally with us, to play with us, to have sex with us when we do not even want for that to happen. That's what she says. That's what she says. Okay? And Joseph, of course, is, the accusation is repeated by her later to her husband, and Joseph is thrown into prison. Okay? Now, first, just something about the term. We know we're called Hebrews, and that's this term Ivri, this Hebrew. The reason we're called Hebrews, and that's why I sort of gave a little bit of the historical references, Hebrew, aver, means to pass over. So Abraham has an ancestor named Aver, but Abraham also is somebody who passes over. He goes from one place to another. He goes from Mesopotamia to Israel. We'll say he goes from Syria, Iraq today to what is Israel today. So that may be the reason as to why he's called that. He is identified back earlier in the book of Bereshit as being an Ivri, and so his descendants are called Ivri. But if you think about this source and you look at it, what is the way in which she accuses Joseph of wrongdoing? She doesn't just say, look, he tried to sleep with me. He took off his clothes. I got his toga right here. Excuse the anachronism. I don't know what a toga was called in ancient Egypt. I've got his toga over here. I got his sheet over here, and he ran away because I refused him, right? She has to add in these extra words. And by adding in these extra words, what does it say? It's saying there's something wrong about him. There's something that's not, he's an Ivri. And that is something that is demonstrating by her saying it, that he is lesser, that there is something different about him and something that's not as good. Now, this is not the only place that happens where we have this sort of statement. 2 chapters later, Joseph is imprisoned. And if you know the story, he's imprisoned in the pits, and there are these 2 men, the cupbearer, and there's the cupbearer, and there is the baker, and they have these dreams, and Joseph interprets their dreams, and they're wowed by him and amazed, and the cupbearer is freed. And later, we know Pharaoh has these dreams, the 7 skinny cows, the 7 fat cows, the 7 skinny cows eat the 7 fat cows. How is that possible? And Pharaoh doesn't want to know what to do, and none of his messengers and none of his wise men know what to do. And then the chief cupbearer speaks up. And this is in the next source, it's in Mem Aleph, and we're going to see the very same thing. He says, Vayedaber sar mashkor paro lemor et chata'ai ani maskirayom. The chief cupbearer then spoke up and said, I must, et chata'ai, my sins I must mention today. Right? He was almost killed. The other person who was in jail with him was hanged. And so it's not something you want to talk about. You don't want to talk about what you've done wrong, but he needs to say it. Why? Because he knows that he knows the guy who can interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And, usually the person who makes the deal gets a percentage, so he'd be in Pharaoh's good graces. And he recounts, Paro was upset as his servant, and he put me in jail. Me and the chief baker, we had dreams the same night, each of us dreaming with a meaning of its own. And then let's look, and this is the Hebrew on the bottom. Okay, so look again, and I'm going to read it in the Hebrew and then in the English. And if you look at it again, you see the bold there. Visham itanu. And when we were in jail, there was somebody with us. It wasn't just the 2 of us. There was at least a 3rd person. There were probably more people, but there's only one other person who is notable who we need to mention. Na'ar Ivri. Eved l'sara tabachim v'nsaper lo v'yiftach lanu lanu t'chalomotenu ish kechalomo patar. With us was a young Hebrew, a servant of the warden, we'll call him. And when we told him our dreams, he interpreted them for us, telling each of us the meaning of his dreams, and the interpretations that he came to pass. I was restored to my post, and the other was hanged, the other was impaled. Okay, so we see the case here as well. Now, let me ask you a question even before that. Obviously, you see what I placed in bold, the idea of the Nar Ivri, but let me ask you, you're not sure tomorrow if you're going to be hanged or you're going to be tortured, or maybe you're just going to go home and it was a mistake. And there was somebody there and they told you everything's going to be okay. And they talked you off the ledge and they da-da-da. And I remember him. You don't remember his name. You don't identify him as such. You call him simply Na'ar Ivri. That's what you're calling him. That's what you believe he is. Again, it is a slur. It is saying that somebody is less than you by calling him this way. By the way, the word Na'ar you can see as an insult as well. Na'ar means somebody who's younger, who's a youth. At times it means somebody who is sort of like a caddy or a sherpa, somebody who's sort of an assistant to somebody else. So here it could mean it that way, right? He was the assistant warden, even though he was a slave. Or if you want to read it in a really derogatory light, you can read it the way I like to translate the word. And with us in prison was a Jew boy, right? And you probably are jarred by my saying that, but think that's what it is. These are derogatory terms that are being used to describe. Earlier, where we had it with him being described, he's not just a servant, and he's not somebody who tried to rape me or seduce me. He is Ivri. And here, what is he? Again, he is Ivri. He is a Hebrew. Now, maybe you don't believe me. Maybe it's just identification, okay? You don't remember who he was, and you say, oh, that person, you identify them based upon their race, based upon their accent, right? And we know sometimes that happens. What did that person look like? He had darker skin, he had lighter skin, he had this, that. Maybe you want to tell me that I'm wrong, that I'm overreacting, and this is not the case, and I'm a terrible reader of the Tanakh, which I may be a terrible reader of the Bible, but I don't think so this time. Look at the next source that we have on the page. I get many things wrong, and could be exaggerating. The next source comes from just two chapters.
Hebrew, excuse me.
Yeah, please. Thank you, Judy.
The Hebrew lends itself to that, though, because Iver means also a transient. So
right.
if you substitute that word, I think it's easy for us to relate to it. People are very fearful of transients.
Right. This is an immigrant. This is somebody who's moving around. This is somebody who's very good. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. So I appreciate that, Judy. You've added on today greatly. So look at the next source. The next source is going to remind you of something. That's okay. Thank you. Nice to meet you. That's great. Thank you so much. I hope everything will be okay for you. So the next source comes from 2 chapters later. This is Joseph is already the king of Egypt, basically. He's the viceroy, he's the second in command. This is his brothers have already come down to Egypt one time. And he recognizes them and they don't recognize him. And he's playing games with them, one can say. It's beyond the scope of what we're discussing today. He's playing games with them. And he's already in charge. He's told his brothers, if you want to come down, you have to come down with your other brother. And they come down, all of the brothers. You've seen the play, Joseph the Technicolor Dreamcoat, you know the story. And Joseph welcomes them. And that's where we're picking up in the middle of the 43rd chapter. Vayavo Yosef habaita, vayaviu lo et haminsa asher biadam habaita. So Joseph comes home, and the brothers have come down, and then they feel they were threatened the first time, and they were told they were going to get more food, and so they bring gifts to him. Their father gave them gifts, and they bring the gifts. And what do? Vaishtachavulo arza, they bow low to him. Of course, you know the story of Joseph and his dreams, and here we have the dreams coming true with the brothers bowing down to him. Vaishalahem l'shalom, and he asked them, how are they? It was also an important word when the brothers and Yosef are described all the way back in the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev. It says, V'lo yachlu dabro l'shalom. They couldn't even say shalom to each other. And here, what is he? He's speaking to them. They're speaking shalom. Vayomer hashalom avichem hazaken asher amartem oden achai. You told me about your dad, your elderly father. Is he still alive? Is he okay? Is everything okay with him? Now, what we have here is a very nice conversation. Almost we could say between equals, right? He obviously is the viceroy. They're coming down to buy bread. They're not equals, but he's treating them in a very nice and courteous manner. If you disagree with me, please speak up or send it into the chat. But it seems that way to me. He's taking, right? This is right. I have an interest in you. I remember you. You told me about your elderly father. How is he? Is he okay? Is everything all right? seems to be very, very nice, very cordial, very welcoming. And then a couple of verses later, it says, we're not going to look at the verse, the last verse in the English. It says, okay, he invites them, we will. Yosef goes. This is the intervening verses. I should have just put them all on the page. My apologies. Yosef is emotionally taken over by seeing his brother Binyamin. He starts to cry. He gets all choked up, and he needs to leave the room. He doesn't want his brothers to see what's going on. He leaves the room. He washes himself up. He comes back into the room, and he says, "Okay, again, let's eat. You guys brought me this present. You brought me this gift, and now he brings them bread to eat." I don't know if they had to pay for this meal or they only paid for the stuff they brought home. It doesn't know. I don't know. And then here we have the key verse, which is boldened in the English or in the Hebrew. Vayasimu lo levado, vilahem levada, vilamitzrim hamito levada, ki lo yuchlun hamitzrim le'echol etavrim lechem, ki to'eva hi lemitzrayim. They served him by himself. Okay, Joseph's the viceroy, he's the king. He eats at the front table. Maybe he gets the best food. And them by themselves, that would be his brothers. They're sitting at a table. And the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves. The Egyptians are not eating with the Jews. Why? For the Egyptians could not dine with the Hebrews, the transients, since that would be an abhorrent to the Egyptians. You read this, and I'm sure everybody thinks the same thing. 1924 Alabama, or Mississippi, or South Carolina. Not that everybody in the North was so great to black people in that point. This is a system with some sort of structural racism, whatever we want to call it. This is a society where already being a Hebrew is less than being an Egyptian. We cannot sit at the same table. We don't drink from the same water fountain. We don't sit in the front of the bus. And coming back to what Judy was saying, this may not have only been to the people that we call Ivrim, the descendants of Abraham. This might have been to other transients, other immigrants, other aliens, whatever word you want to use. But clearly we see, at least to me, and this is why I said I'm right about what I said earlier, there is a problem in Egypt. There is the main group, which is the Egyptians. And I don't know if there are other groups, the Ethiopians, I don't know. Egypt was a very large empire and encompassed what would be multiple countries today. But there are groups of people who are treated as lesser, who are seen as lesser, who are described as lesser, whose sins are described as, right? They're described that way because it's indicative of who they are. And that is what we have in Egypt. And so earlier, right when the wife of Potiphar says this Hebrew this transient was brought to play with us, to rape me, to seduce us, she means it in that way with that vitriol. When the cupbearer is saying to Pharaoh, he's saying, this is a person who comes from this race that's lesser, these people who are worse, these people who are less than us, okay? So I think it's entrenched in Egypt. It's there. It's something that we see. It's not something that just comes out. And again, this is all coming to Pharaoh. This is why Pharaoh, a couple hundred years later, they may have accepted Yosef. They may have accepted his family. They may have accepted a larger family. And when people start to come in, Egypt may have benefited in some ways from the population of these Ivrim, these Hebrews coming in. But all of a sudden, when they feel threatened, when they feel worried, when they are scared, what happens? Bam, right back to the Jewish hatred. And there he takes it much worse, because it's one thing if it's a couple of people and they're sitting at the table on the left and the Egyptians are sitting at the table on the right. It's a different thing when you have got 50,000, 100,000, 500,000 people. You have a potential fifth column. They're going to join the enemy. So there has to be very, very strong and severe things that happen. And so it doesn't just occur on one day that Pharaoh says, those Jews, those Hebrews, they're not like us. They're going to rebel against us. And yes, as was asked, and that's when the enslavement begins. But we see it doesn't start on day one. But I want to show you one more thing with it. One more piece, one more thing that in some ways is incredible, but in other ways isn't. And this is going backwards, okay? So now we're on the bottom of the page that has the words Mem Aleph. In the English, it's the last page. And this is going back to the 41st chapter. Everybody with me? Okay? We're back to the 41st chapter. We're back before Joseph is viceroy. We're right after the cupbearer says, I remember this Jew boy, this transient, this immigrant, this alien, this non-Egyptian who was in prison with us. And without the verses, they go into the prison, they pull up Joseph, they give him a haircut to make him look good in front of Pharaoh. They bring him to the palace. Pharaoh recounts his dreams. Joseph gives his brilliant ideas, the storehouses. We're going to have lots of crops. And if we have lots of crops, what's going to happen? We're going to become the breadbasket of the world. And Egypt was the breadbasket of the world because of the Nile River. It wasn't only during Joseph's time. That's true for centuries. Maybe it was most pronounced at this time. And Pharaoh, after hearing Joseph's plan, that's where we pick up in chapter 41. And I'm going to read from the Hebrew. Vayitav hadavar be'enei paro uvenei kol avadav. And when Joseph said, this whole idea, the 7 skinny cows, 7 fat cows, 7 lean years, 7 strong, good years of good crops, but the lean years are going to be so bad that they're going to suck up all of the good, and so we need to prepare. Okay, he tells him, and Paro thinks this is a great idea. He loves the interpretation; it makes sense. Everybody agrees. All of the other messengers, all of the other wise men, all agree this is a very smart guy. And then Pharaoh makes him. This is in the bowl. Vayomer Paro el avadav hanimsach hazaish asher ruach Elohim bo. An amazing statement. What does Pharaoh say? He says, is there anybody like this guy? Now, what is Pharaoh saying when he says that? This person has the Spirit of God. This is a great moment for Pharaoh. Pharaoh is transcending race. It doesn't matter that this person has been introduced to him as Na'ar Ivri. Pharaoh says, I don't care that he is from the lesser class, that he is from the people that we can't even sit together with and eat with. It will be revealed later. I don't care, because this is the best person for the job. This is the person who has the Spirit of God with him. And Pharaoh looks great there. Pharaoh, it's amazing. Look at who Pharaoh is. Pharaoh doesn't care that this is somebody from the lesser class. A great moment, yes? Everybody agree with me? Interesting for a moment before we continue. Think about where we started with the later Pharaoh. The Pharaoh, Asher lo yadat Yosef. The Pharaoh who didn't know Yosef, who pretended or really didn't know him. This Pharaoh doesn't care who anybody's background is. He cares about his country. He cares about his people. He cares about his civilization. That's what he cares about. He doesn't care that Joseph is in Hebrew, that he's from the lesser class, because he's the right man for the job. It's an amazing moment. The moment doesn't last. Let's continue. Any comments about that? So here we see, at least this is my reading. We're just going to continue. Okay? The very same source. Paro then says to Yosef, Ayomer Paro, I'm going to read from the Hebrew, El Yosef. Acharei hodia Elohim otcha kol zot ein navon v'chachom kemocha. Atati al beiti v'al picha yishak kol ami rak hakisei egdal mimeka. Pharaoh says to Joseph, God revealed all this stuff to you. You are the smartest guy around. You can be in charge of everything. The only thing is, officially, I am the king and you are not the king, but I trust you 100%. Still sounds amazing, right? I don't care that you're Hebrew, that you're the transient, that you're the immigrant, that you're not one of us. I'm just going to be technically higher above you, but you have all the power. Vayomer Paro el Yosef, the next verse. Re'ei natati otcha kol eretz Mitzrayim. Here you are, Joseph. You are in charge of all of Egypt. And again, think about that with the background, right? It's all still amazing. Think about, right? If in 1861 or whatever year, I don't know what year it was, if a black man, an African-American man, would have been made president of the Confederacy, right? Or at least vice president. I would say president. Unthinkable. Inconceivable, right? That, in a sense, is what's being said here. But then things got interesting. Vayasa paro et tabato mayal yado vayitenota al yad Yosef. Pharaoh takes his signet ring, the ring, the stamp where he would, sign his name, and he gives it to Joseph. Vayalbeishoto bigdei shesh vayasem revid hazahav al tzavara. And he goes and he gives Joseph clothing. Okay, he gives him new clothing. Okay, very good. Sounds good, right? Joseph came out of prison. He came out of the pit. And then Joseph is riding around in the chariots like Spartacus in the movie. Asher lo vayikru lefanav avrech v'natano to al kol eretz Mitzrayim, and he's being paraded around Egypt in his new beautiful gold clothing and all this colored clothing, and they're calling in front of him avrech, perhaps related to the word baruch, to be blessed. This is the person of blessing. Either he's the person who's blessed, or he's the person who gives blessing. It's not exactly clear 100% what the word means, but we'll go with that. Clearly, this is a pageant. This is a parade. Yosef is being paraded around. Vayomer Paro el Yosef. Again, he says the same thing. Pharaoh says to Yosef, Ani Paro, I am Pharaoh. Uvaladecha lo yarim ishet yado vet raglo b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. I am Pharaoh, so I'm above you. But with the exception of me, nobody is going to do anything in Egypt. You are the main guy. You are in charge. Nobody's going to lift a finger unless you allow. And let's continue with the last verse. Vayikra Paro Shem Yosef Sofnat Paneach. Vayitain lo et Osnat bat Potifera Kohen on liisha. Vayetze Yosef al Eretz Mitzrayim. Pharaoh renames Yosef Sofnat Paneach. The word safun means like hidden. Paneach probably means the revealer of secrets. You may know that word safun when you're singing at the beginning of your Pesach Seder. Safun, we usually call it afikoman, but here it's right, safun, hidden. He calls him the revealer of that which is hidden, the revealer of secrets. And he gives him a wife, Osnat, the daughter of Potiphera, and Yosef goes out to Egypt. There are two ways. There's the main way of reading these verses. And please, you can argue with me at any time. The main way of reading these verses, and I don't think that that's wrong, is this is beautiful. Yosef became the president. Pharaoh doesn't care who he is, transcends race. And what is now that he has this position of importance, what does Pharaoh need to do? He needs to give him nobility, the clothing of nobility. He needs everybody to be praising him. He needs to give him a nice Egyptian name and a nice Egyptian wife. Well, the last two don't make as much sense, right? But you're a person of great importance. And you should be called as such, and you should be seen as such, and you should be viewed as such, and you should have a noble wife. So in many ways, it makes sense, right? That's what Pharaoh does to Yosef. Or you can be a little bit cynical, or a lot cynical, and you can read the verses with a little bit of cynicism, which is sort of, I think, correct. I'm not saying that the first part is not wrong. That first reading, if this is Yosef, you're going to be the viceroy of Egypt. You need to look the part. You need to be called the part. You need to play the part, right? You need to have everything together. Or you can look at it, or at the same time you can look and you can say, what is Paro doing? What Paro is doing is he's taking Yosef and he's bringing his white out and he's whiting out Yosef. He's making him, he's not Yosef anymore. He's not a Hebrew anymore. He's Sofnat Paneach. He's a local. He rose to power. We don't know exactly his background. God spoke to him. We don't know where he came from. He's not a Hebrew. What do you mean? He's got this Egyptian name. He has an Egyptian wife. He's walking around in Egyptian clothing. He's being lauded and paraded in front of everybody as the great Egyptian. This is, I believe, and again, you don't have to read the verses this way, but I think that this is what is happening here. On a deeper level. Yes, Pharaoh is transcending the racism, the second class, which is the Hebrews, or maybe it's all transients, and maybe it's all foreigners in Egypt. Pharaoh is pushing that to the side. He's able to recognize greatness, which is an amazing moment. But I think even as he recognizes greatness, he also recognizes that he lives in a society where there is a two-class system. There are the Egyptians, and then there are the others. And yes, he may be in charge, and he may be in power, and he may be the person who's running the show and the most important man in Egypt. But that doesn't mean that he's going to last there on the throne if the person that he gives power to is some foreigner and is some transient. And later, a future Pharaoh will reveal that we're scared of the Jews. We're scared of the Hebrews, I should call them. We're scared that they might join our enemy. And so this Joseph may have been viewed in the same way as a Manchurian candidate. He's coming, you're giving him all the power. Well, maybe he's taking that power, and maybe at some critical moment, he's going to be viewed in this way. Paro doesn't necessarily believe that, but Paro may believe that the populace believes that, and he's going to hide Joseph's identity. I'm giving you the best Egyptian clothing. You're going to be walking around and nobody's going to think you're anything but an Egyptian. You're going to have a beautiful Egyptian name. You're going to have a beautiful Egyptian wife and Egyptian children. That's who you are going to be. That's what Pharaoh does here with Yosef. And I don't think that it's necessarily when Pharaoh was doing this, I don't think that Pharaoh was doing it as sort of like some avowed anti-Semite, anti-Semitism is not a real term in the Torah, this avowed hater of Hebrews. I think he's doing it because he's worried about what the ramifications might be if the people know that the man running the country is somebody from this lesser race and lesser people. And so it's to me, and we'll take some time. I'm basically going to stop there. Let me summarize for a couple of minutes. And if you have some questions, let me just go back. We'll summarize. And if we have some questions, I saw there was a question there, and we'll come back to that. Basic idea, we started with source, Sinai, Sin'ah. They sound the same. Hatred comes at the time of the revelation of Sinai, that everybody's jealous, that they didn't get the Torah. Is it something that just comes together with the Torah, part and parcel? You accept the Torah, you become a Jew. It's part of who you are, is this hatred of Jews? Or is it sort of the victim, which again, some of the rabbis in the past, they've interpreted and understood this line this way. Is it that we got the Torah, we thought we're better than everybody else, and as a result of that is anti-Semitism? That's where we started. And then what we went into is a discussion of what I wanted to demonstrate and to show, which I hope I have. If I haven't, please argue with me. Or if you want to add points like Judy did earlier to help me out, please do. The story of the Jews, the Hebrews in Egypt. And the Hebrews in Egypt, who are first called a nation by Pharaoh. Pharaoh, Asher lo yadat Yosef. Pharaoh who didn't know Yosef. The Pharaoh who hides Yosef, right? He enslaves them. There's genocide. But enslavement and genocide, what we tried to point out today, doesn't happen on day one. We know this from our history. The Nazis, they don't start killing Jews en masse in 1933. You first have to demonize them. You have to make them vermin. You have to make them lesser. And we see that that is what existed in Egypt. He's not just a slave. He's an Ish Ivri. He's a transient. He's a foreigner. He's an alien. He's a Hebrew. He's a passerby, and he tried to rape me, and I have his shirt in my hand. I was in prison, and who was there in prison with me? Some Jew boy, some transient, some lesser person. We see the structured racism. The Hebrews can't sit together with the Egyptians. It would be abhorrent. It would be a to'eva, a word in Hebrew. The word to'eva is used many times in the Torah to describe all sorts of different sins and all sorts of different things, which the word is used to state, not only are you not allowed to do this, but this is a to'eva. This is an abomination. It would be an abomination for the Hebrews to sit together with the Egyptians. And we see that Pharaoh, for a moment, is able to transcend that. But after transcending that, at least the way that I want to read the verse, is Pharaoh then goes and he takes Joseph and he removes his identity. He removes his identity and he makes him, as far as everybody else is concerned, an Egyptian. And so staying under the radar there is this hatred. Now, let me make one last point with that, by the way, which is Joseph, to an extent, at the end of his life, hides who he is. He's not doing it purposely, but you can't blame the guy. He was thrown in a pit by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He may have thought that his father was even part of the plot. Who knows? His father told him to check on his brothers. His father knows he doesn't get along with his brother. Joseph is sent into slavery. He's right. He's a slave. He's in prison. His life is not simple. He rises to power, and he basically forgets that part of his life to a certain extent. And he's only reminded of it at this point in time. So when Pharaoh hides him and Pharaoh makes him, and as the way I'm reading into an Egyptian noble and an Egyptian leader, Joseph is able to go along with it. He can hide these things. Only when his brothers come to town that he returns and he remembers the dreams that he forgot about a long time ago. The delusions, or I guess they weren't such delusions, of grandeur when he was a youth. And it comes back to him and it comes out. And others who appear, by the way, in Egypt, and Joseph reveals himself to them, it comes out very quickly. The brothers, Joseph tells the brothers who they are. If you know the story, Joseph kicks everybody out of the room outside of his brothers, and he says, Ani Yosef, I am your brother Joseph, who you sold to Egypt, and don't be upset, blah, blah, blah. And very quickly, word spreads. It says just a verse later, Vayishma Mitzrayim, Vayishma Beit Paro, all the way in the house of Pharaoh, all over Egypt. Everybody hears that Joseph's brothers have come down to Egypt. So Joseph, at the same time that his identity is hidden and we don't know who he is, his brothers come down and we can't hide who he is anymore. It can't be hidden. It's clear that his family is coming down. It's clear that not all of them look the same as the Egyptians. And so the racism or the class system or the hatred, which maybe could have been hidden if there was only one Yosef, is now back. It's below, under the radar. And unfortunately, when you have a system like this, with certain people being the prime group and other people being the secondary group and the worst group and the picked on group, even if it's not apparent and it's not obvious and it's not out in the open, eventually what's going to happen, unfortunately, too many times, and not only the history of Jews, the history of many people, is it comes out at some point in time, that underground hatred, and it comes out with all sorts of horrific genocides, enslavements, etc., etc. So this is just something, ideas, thoughts, looking at the Torah, looking at the way that our people were treated. And all I could say in terms of a takeaway beyond just the academic, and then please, if we have some questions, there's not much that we can do regarding, I don't know what we can do regarding, people who see us as a fifth column or something that's lesser, but with other races and with other people, we need to be very careful to not allow for racist, to not allow for classes, whatever word you want to use, views, because I think the Torah is trying to tell us is when you start with views and you start with bad remarks and you look at people as lesser, which is already bad enough, it can lead very quickly to some very, very horrendous, to genocides and to enslavement, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to be very, very careful in terms of how we treat others, people from other backgrounds. Michael, did you have a question? I see your hand is raised, and please go ahead.
What you're presenting is that there are Egyptians and then there are Hebrews. And this is a multi-century period in which there was a lot of different groups and a lot of changes and a lot of ethnic challenges coming in. Isn't there another way of looking? This was maybe after 100 years or two that the separate identity of the Hebrews behind themselves kind of lost identification with this constantly shifting environment, as Egypt was kind of the center of the civilized world at the time, and that this is a story of a reemergence of the Hebrew people and in the story of Joseph and coming out.
Yeah, I would say yes and yes. I would say that what you said is could be 100% correct, and I don't think that it necessarily contradicts what I'm saying. I think they both can be correct from the Egyptian perspective as well as from the perspective of the Jews, the reemergence of our identity. I think both of them can come. I think both of them can be correct. So yes, I appreciate that point. And obviously, without a full Egyptologist here and study of the particulars of every aspect of Egyptian society back then, we cannot get into all the details, but I appreciate that. And yes, I think that's very much is another very valid reading of the story. So thank you for adding that. Yes. If your name is Michael, unless it's Claudia, then you have questions or you want to say something. Go ahead.
This is Michael Levin. You could go back to resentment of Hebrews or Jews to 3 different sister-wife episodes. These are tricky folks. They will rip you off. Or you could look at the rape of Dinah and say, gee, these folks go over the top and kill everybody and kill all the males in town and take over all the land that they had. So you could go even earlier than you went.
Right.
For resentment of Jews.
Yeah, I think that you're right. What I'm trying to show are not reasons for people to be anti-Semitic, but they are a story and an incident of anti-Semitism. I will tell you with that, there is a problem amongst the line of Abraham with trickery in the book of Breshit. 100%. It's something that we have Yaakov tricking his father, taking advantage of his brother when he's hungry. We have his brothers then also, his sons also do the same thing. So we have those aspects to us. But, everybody has, I'm not going to the word vices, but, everybody has an evil inclination and everybody has, different people, it's different things. Not everybody is, a trickster in this. So there are those things exist, but yes, anti-Semites. If you want to say that Jews are tricky and they're cheaters and they etc., there are certainly earlier stories in the book of Breshit that you can point to make that argument. So I appreciate that, Michael. Yes. I appreciate that very much. Let me mention one. No. Let me mention one last thing with that, which was sort of Michael. There are those who argue, and it's not such a terrible argument, that the Jews brought the enslavement upon themselves. It didn't include the chapter. It's about it's a later chapter in Genesis where eventually all of the Egyptians have no money left. They have no cattle left. And what Joseph does, what they do is they sort of sell themselves to Pharaoh and they become sharecroppers on their own land because the famine is so severe. So there are those, and this is part of the point, and I guess this is the last thing to say, there are those who say the Jews cause the enslavement themselves. Joseph paves the way to enslavement by enslaving the Egyptians first. Now, the enslavement of the Egyptians is not the type of enslavement, A, that the Jews were enslaved with. That's A. And B, what I want to show you today is that the enslavement of the Jews happened not because of what Joseph says, but well before that, there was this system in Egypt that looked at the Hebrews as being lesser. And I think that's a much better reading, although you could read it that way as well. Yes, there's a lot of victim blaming and shaming, but that's not what's at the core here. Now, there was a question here in the chat, which I want to get to, question of chosenness, which is sort of, a little bit beyond where we are to understand that. Question of chosenness. Whoever sort of typed that question, do you want to just, do you mind describing what you wanted to ask? And then we're gonna, if you need to head out, it's been an hour. You can certainly stay on for longer, but if you need to run, please at any time. Do you want to ask any, in a more particular way what that question is? That's the question of chosenness is a little bit beyond what we are saying above. We'll just say that. In Jewish literature, in Jewish tradition, there are certainly voices historically who have said that chosenness means we're better. I will not deny that there was not many a great rabbi who believed that historically. I'm sure there are many people. I'm sure there are many people who still believe that today. And there is a very valid thought process, which chosenness doesn't mean that the Jews are better in any way. It means that we have these set of responsibilities. Not for today. There is a way of reading the early chapters in the book of Breshit, which is put forward by a biblical commentary in the Middle Ages, Rav Ovadia Sforno, who basically points out that over and over again, the world fails in the early chapters of Genesis, and God is sort of stuck and forced into finding a person to be his representative on earth because the world can't seem to get it right. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood generation, the flood generation of the Tower of Babel. And so God chooses Abraham and chooses his descendants, but not because they are better and not because they are special in any way, but rather it's almost like, you can make the joke, I hope, well, I'll tell it this way. My parents used to make a joke that my father's best friend, son, he went to Columbia, which used to be a badge of honor in the Jewish community, and he was incredibly smart and hardworking, and I think he was the valedictorian of his high school, and I had 3 brothers, and none of us were valedictorians of our high schools. We went to college, don't get me wrong, I hope we've done well in life, but my parents used to joke, they said, well, maybe if we only had one child, maybe our child would have also been valedictorian. So I don't know how I got there, but it's not that child was better, but God is maybe saying, if I'm trying to have everybody follow these laws, it's not going to work. So I'm going to find one person, and hopefully he will be able to, and his family will be able to reveal what I want from the world, and therefore we will get to. So chosenness is a whole topic. I'm sure that if you send an email to Rav Shmuley, that he can find an expert on that area from a variety of different places who would be very happy to address that topic at greater length and not give it 2 minutes at the end of a class, which certainly is far from what is deserved. So thank you, everybody, for joining me. Any last questions? If not, I have to get home to the 4 children who I ignore. So that was a joke. They're very loud. You can't ignore them. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the comments. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them my way. And wishing everybody a wonderful afternoon.